Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week, we're going to hear two specials in two separate episodes, basically exploding the radio edition into its components. In this one you've clicked on, you'll hear Mel B from Omaha, Nebraska, talk about the protests there, including the killing of James Scurlock on May 30th, demonstrations for justice in his case, the mass arrest of 120 people on July 25th during a BLM protest, and more. Check the show notes for links to Mel online and the great groups that Mel drops. If you want to hear the other half of this dis-enjoined pair, you can look online for an episode called RVA in the Uprising with Elle and Bez, where you'll hear those two talk about mutual aid and the Richmond Community Bail Fund, struggles to remove Confederate monuments around that former capital of the CSA, and other topics. The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Yeah. This is M1, M.A. Uno, M.A. de la gente comprende y entiende, you feel me? I'm one half of Dead Prez, to tell it like it is, everything is political rap duo. Here holding my middle finger up to imperialism worldwide. And you in tune right now to the rebel beat.
The Rebel Beat is a monthly podcast of radical political music across different genres and across different continents. It's the mixtape to a riot against police brutality. It's your nightly newscast set to bass and beats. It's protest anthems from Hong Kong to Istanbul to Ferguson to Montreal. Give it a listen at rebelbeatradio.com or subscribe today on all your favorite podcast platforms.
Also, if you want some free Sean Swain for President bumper stickers, send us an email or a letter with your address and we will mail you some. Thanks a lot for taking the time to have this chat. Would you mind introducing yourself a little bit for the audience and talk about your journalism and the writing that you do?
Sure. My name's Mel B. I publish under both Melanie Buer and Mel G, depending on which publication you're looking at. I've been sort of doing various projects related to journalism for the last couple of years, a little bit part-time. I'm also in grad school getting a master's degree in literature, which I'm hopefully finishing up soon so I can get the out of grad school. It sucks. I'm the associate editor of Protean magazine, and I'm a co-host and part-time producer of Protean's official podcast, Protean Pirate Radio. I am also a member of the IWW Freelance Journalists Union, and so I publish in the Industrial Worker, as well as various other outlets. You're likely going to find me more under the byline Melanie Buer than Mel G, but most of my recent works come out of Protean, so look around. There's some good stuff there.
Could you say a few words about what Protean does, like what that project is intended for?
Yeah, Protean magazine is a distinctly anti-capitalist, leftist independent media project, sort of like built out of this Protean media collective that I'm part of. We publish poetry, fiction, critique online, book reviews online, and then we put out a print magazine with various articles. Right now it's about once a year. It's quite a project. We just finished volume 2. And that came out, I believe, in January or February, if I'm remembering correctly. And some of the people that were published in that issue were Lyda Gold from Current Affairs, Max Alvarez from Working People Pod, a lot of really cool poets. We had some really great art. But yeah, our model is based entirely on reader donations. We don't take ad revenue, and we don't sell ads because that sucks. And so we sort of collectively edit the online verticals together. And I'm hoping to carve out a space in, leftist independent media and contribute something to that pretty robust media ecosystem. So, yeah.
And it's cool that y'all are taking on, in a lot of ways, a distinctly, artistic approach and leaving space for that, because a lot of alongside of, analytical pieces and critical pieces, but yeah, I personally don't see a lot of that based on my normal reading patterns, so that's exciting.
Yeah, it's great. It's really fun. And we have so many good writers, good poets, really good fiction writers who have, submitted some of the best that I've read in years, and it's nice. It makes me feel good that we are able to provide a platform where we can also, we try and pay our writers fairly and quickly. No one publishes anything in either the print or the online that isn't paid for it, either upon publication or when we receive a first draft. So we make sure that our writers feel like they can publish in our magazine and that we as editors can provide a portion of an income to them, so.
Yeah, that's dope. That's a good model. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about Omaha, where you're based, and maybe kind of describe for folks geographically what it's like, the demographics and the political feel and the culture of the place as you've experienced it.
Sure, yeah. Omaha is sort of a uniquely blue city in a entirely red state. It's the most populous city in the state, and Lincoln is second, except on Husker game days when Lincoln becomes one of the most populous areas due to people going to see the football games. Omaha is a really weird. Okay, it's kind of difficult to sort of explain it, but the legacy of redlining in our city means that there are sort of boroughs. North Omaha features a predominantly black population. South Omaha features a predominantly Hispanic population. West Omaha is sort of like the area of affluent white flight. And it's very clearly delineated based on income and class distinction. It's really, you don't notice it until you've been living here for a while that that's kind of what the city looks like. We have a hyper-militarized police force with a bloated city budget that is presiding over all of it. It's got that small town vibe, even though the city has almost 1 million people in its metro area. So it's a lot of your sort of like country bumpkin farm town vibes that's mixed with extremely gentrified neighborhoods and these sort of entertainment districts. We have too many restaurants. I mean, it's just kind of a weird city to live in. And each community feels insulated from itself, from each other. I live in sort of the Midtown area, which has a pretty young, mostly working class population surrounded by gentrified neighborhoods full of tech aficionados and architecture and engineering firms. It's a really weird area. I live 2 blocks away from a gentrified shopping center and apartments that are $2,200 a month to live in. When my own apartment costs me, $600 for a 2-bedroom, right? And it's literally 2 blocks over. You're in this shopping center. They knocked down half of a working class neighborhood to put it up, So we're all just kind of crammed in together. And politically speaking, it's fairly progressive here. As you know, this is a red state, so obviously that's not always the case. But we have had some minor successes in this city sort of voting blue for presidential elections. I think in 2008, when Obama was elected, it was one of the first times that this area had actually consistently voted blue and managed to get that across all the districts across the board inside the city limits. It was a really sort of unique situation. Even before and since then, there's always been this sort of pretty resilient pocket of socialists and progressive liberals and progressive Democrats, politically speaking, within the city. There are multiple groups that have started this summer. There's also some that have been going for over a decade. Like the Food Not Bombs project here has been going for quite some time. I remember in 2005, they were working on projects out here. So, at least 15 years they've been downtown living the mission of Food Not Bombs, handing out food to the homeless and providing, mutual aid and community aid. And then we have groups like the Omaha Tenants United, which is a tenants union that started a couple years back that's run by some pretty great people. We've got the Nebraska Left Coalition, which I believe started in 2017, I think, after Trump's election, that most recently is notable for providing coronavirus relief, grocery packages to folks during the first couple of months of the COVID lockdowns, and bail support over the summer. The last couple of years really has been great for them. But, over the summer, they've really perfected their bail and jail support. So they've been essentially the go-to jail support for protesters who have been arrested and need to be bailed out. And they bailed out something like 75 of the 120 protesters who were arrested 2 weeks ago. And then prior to that, they, got a lot of funding just from donations around the city, between May and the middle of June, to also bail out a significant portion of those protesters. And they don't ask for anything in return. So it's pretty sweet. One of the other organizations that's been working this summer is an organization called Pro-Black. It's PROBLAC. And it's an organization that is centered around uplifting Black and Indigenous voices, particularly voices of women and non-binary folks within the leadership structure of the organization. And they have been the ones who have been sort of spearheading a lot of the most recent activity that's been going on in the city. Other various things are like Culture House, which is CULXR House, that operates in North Omaha. It's sort of like a community area that's sort of political and based in, community arts projects. It's got a studio that you can be a part of. The Union of Contemporary Art is also a Black-run union. I believe that's what it's called. I'm going to have to double check on that name.
Sure.
But that's also in North Omaha. And if you pay dues to the building, you have access to all these art facilities that are extremely difficult to get access to otherwise. So there's all of these really interesting, good community programs that are both either explicitly socialist or anarchist or whatever flavor of left you want, and also that are based really in just providing space and responding to community need all across the eastern part of the city. Once you get further west, you don't see much of that same activity that's happening. Though this summer, there have been multiple large rallies organized in West Omaha, specifically geared at bringing, an anti-racist Black Lives Matter message to these affluent neighborhoods in West Omaha, which has been a really interesting thing to watch. So I don't know if that helps. There's a lot. It's very complex. It's a weird sort of hodgepodge of things going on in a city that has a fairly racist legacy that is trying to live down, and is, trying to live down the sort of, or find ways to break down the very deep trenches that were dug as a legacy of redlining in the city. The history of Omaha is very unique. There was quite a strong socialist foothold at the beginning of the 20th century. There were race riots in the first, I think in 1919, where a Black man was lynched outside of the courthouse. And as a response to those riots and the socialist agitation that had been happening beforehand, the city began instituting redlining policies and building covenant neighborhoods that really destroyed a lot of the ability for any sort of mobility within, economically or otherwise, within the city. So we're kind of dealing with the cultural legacy of that. And so the fact that we are continuing this conversation surrounding policing and police brutality is really, really heartening to me, because it's always been something where you just know that Omaha is this place that looks great on paper, but once you really start to see the divisions once you move here and you see what's going on and you see the economic depression in a lot of these areas, and seeing stuff like Pro-Black crop up and becomes extremely efficient in their organizing almost right off the bat is really cool. And seeing, this intergenerational move by longtime activists, new activists, Black leadership is really, really sweet. And it's something that I am extremely grateful that I have the ability to watch and observe as, a journalist.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and you're hearing Mel B on the continued protests against police killings in Omaha, Nebraska. So I think one of the exciting things about watching this uprising has been, and one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you, like in particular, besides what we're going to talk about with the mass arrest and the implications of that, is how different parts of Turtle Island have been sort of dealing with the scope and the realities on the ground where people are of this. Like, it's not just a protest about this terrible thing that happened in Minneapolis or / Louisville / whatever other number of cities where Black life has been taken by police, but you're seeing people contend with the literal, like, made infrastructure, the city, the landscape they're living on and with, to sort of reimagine or to, like, pinpoint, like, and point out to their neighbors, like, look, this is not just a problem in that city, like, over there. This is not just a problem with that one killing. Here's how the environment that we're living in is literally structured by white supremacy and settler colonialism. So that's cool to hear you talk about, like, these specific issues. And I imagine that pro-Black and other groups that are there and the people that have been taking the streets have been pointing to the realities in Omaha and surrounding areas as they've been playing out over the last 150 years of colonialism, right?
Right. Well, and I think it's also unique to the situation that we find ourselves in, where this pandemic has sort of laid bare the various infrastructural systemic problems, aberrations, really, of how this capitalist system has built itself, right? You don't really have the ability to keep that mask on, that shield on that says, oh, we'll just bootstrap our way out of it. What you see is the sort of, like, lifting of the veil across the country, mass unemployment, a government that is completely unable or unwilling to provide and ensure the stability of its citizens, a giant depression that's worse than 2008, that is once again disenfranchised a lot of tired millennials and has incensed a new generation of political activists, right? And so what happened with George Floyd is this sort of, first off, the amount of unemployed folks to go out into the streets was, extremely helpful to how this whole thing exploded, right? These folks who are stuck in quarantine for 2.5 months, who are just brooding on the fact that this country is f***ing awful, right? And then they see something like the murder of George Floyd at the hands of 4 cops, and they go, holy f***ing shit, are we really doing this again? Absolutely not, And I think also this speaks to just how widespread police violence and brutality is in this country. It's, it's entrenched in the very cultural and economic fabric of how this country operates. And when you see constantly cops racially profiling and killing young Black men and women, sometimes when they're sleeping in their beds, it's too much, right? And so all of this became this kind of flashpoint in the end of May, and has sustained itself because there's no end in sight until this, we continue, right? We're not free till we're all free, right? And what's really good is that we do have this younger, generation, younger millennials and young, old and young Zoomers who have come of age, who have witnessed this and lived through this, right? And either been radicalized by, various other problems like wearing bulletproof vests to schools and just so they can go to class, and then seeing some of their friends and family murdered at the hands of police. The pro-Black organization, a lot of their leadership is, in their late 20s. It's my age and a little bit older. But the vast majority of the people that I've talked to at these protests are anywhere from, 16 to 25. They're young, younger than me, and ready to fight and willing to continue fighting and have endless stores of energy, right? And are responding to things within our own community that are very clear to see, particularly surrounding, inaction of the city to even remotely entertain the idea that a reduction in a police budget is possible. And we're also seeing inaction by the city to protect its people by issuing a mask mandate, right? There's a lot, it's all interconnected. And we're seeing these folks connect the dots in a very meaningful way, both personally for them and for their politics and their organizing. And every time that I talk to these folks, they've educated themselves a little bit more. They have, their ideas become a little bit more cogent. And pro-Black is really good because they have a clear set of demands that they want as a result of all of this that the city is unwilling to even entertain. So they're ready to just keep fighting this until someone listens to them, and actually puts into place action that they themselves believe is going to be appropriate for the situation that we are currently living through. And it's really inspiring. Let me just say that the first couple of months of quarantine for me were really depressing. There was a lot of despair there, and the summer, this uprising, this insurrectionary summer has really lit my fire again. And we actually, have something to hope for, even though our government and the empire is sort of crumbling beneath our feet.
Well, I'd be interested in hearing about how you've seen as a journalist and as an Omahaan. Is that the right term?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
As an Omahaan, how you've witnessed the response to the protests in Minneapolis and the sort of localization of it in Omaha.
Well, I left Omaha in the first days of the uprising to actually go report in Minneapolis. I was there for the early morning hours of the 29th for about to the end of that weekend, and witnessed, a day of riots, and then the introduction of the National Guard to the mix, and how that changed police tactics, and watched these peaceful protesters outside of the police precincts getting brutalized as they were sitting on the ground. Cops were just throwing volleys of flashbangs right into their laps. Folks were running and limping away. It was a war zone my last day there. And, communities had both rallied to try and help protesters and sent armed guards into the neighborhoods, and vigilantes were stalking protesters. And my group of journalists, I had linked up with some people who came in from New York who were with me in my car, and we got noticed that this guy, this guy stalked us through the neighborhoods. We weren't able to leave. It got to the point where they had closed the bridges to St. Paul, where our hotel was, and we heard on the police scanners that they had called in a suspicious vehicle with Nebraska plates, which was me. We had to sneak out of the city and stay in a hotel outside of city limits in order to find safety, because even though we had press credentials, the cops had been targeting press for days at that point. And during that time, I was getting news about what was going on in Omaha. And the first night of riots and the night that James Scurlock was murdered, I think I was on my way back. The city had responded by tear gassing folks without provocation. They had led folks to believe that they would be able to occupy this intersection at 72nd and Dodge, which is it's a main thoroughfare for the city and gets a lot of traffic. So people like to set up rallies there all the time. And they led them into the street. They had blocked off the traffic, and then they used it as an excuse to brutalize the protesters, saying that they were obstructing traffic, right? Which is a tactic that we saw on 725 as well. This, in turn, led to marches that ended up downtown, I think either the next day. Some windows got broken. According to videos that I saw, folks were having a dance party in the street, and cops started indiscriminately shooting pepper balls and throwing tear gas into the crowds. Without much of as far as I could tell, they didn't really announce themselves. It was just, we're going to break this up right now. Here we go, And that night, a white supremacist bar owner named Jake Gardner, whose bar is located downtown, apparently started posting on Facebook that he was going to go downtown, essentially looking for trouble. He brought his gun and his dad with him. He had no concealed carry permit for his weapon. Ended up starting a fight with just random protesters who were walking by his bar. Someone else had, I guess, thrown bricks through the bar window or something. And he just targeted these kids that were close by. Some argument or scuffle ensued. I think the report is that he pulled his gun out, fired 2 warning shots in the air. The two young people tried to wrestle the gun away from him, is what I'm hearing. I haven't looked at the security camera video in a while. And then James Scurlock was shot in the neck. He was 20 years old. He was a young father. And he died on that pavement, right? And they chose not to charge Jake Gardner. They cited self-defense. It took them about 36 hours to come to that conclusion after the death of James Scurlock. And the protests since then have covered a range of issues, but is almost always focused on the James Scurlock case. Folks do not think that this is right. They believe, and I am inclined to be with them there, that they did not get justice in the murder of this young father who was just trying to provide support for a Black Lives Matter movement. And at every turn, the county prosecutor's office has been they don't care. I mean, like the actual like press conference that they had where they said they chose not to charge Jake Gardner, in the midst of a curfew being instigated and, wide unrest, they're mispronouncing his last name, right? Don't care if they're being corrected. They just don't care, man. They don't care who this person is. And it wasn't until folks pushed really hard, like very, very hard, that the Douglas County attorney agreed to recommend a grand jury to convene in this case. They have cited that it hasn't happened yet because of the pandemic, and yet eviction courts are open. So it's very clear that this is going to be a long fight for folks. And organizations like Pro-Black have really targeted their message, and many of their demands are about James. Mm-hmm. And, also about the various problems that we have in the city regarding police and the police force, and the fact that they pretty much can act with near impunity in many cases. And Nebraska statutes protect their identities in the case of trying to get information to the public about specific officers and officer complaints. I just figured that out, trying to FOIA that information.
So it seems like if they're not going to provide that sort of information, it must be pretty difficult to even build some sort of case that a specific officer has a routine history of complaints of use of force or whatever else, harassment against members of the public, right?
Right. Even if you had an officer's name and you submitted a public records request on that officer's conduct record, Nebraska state statute protects all details of the conduct records, both the complainant's name and the officer's name, any details of the investigation, any details of the occurrence that led to a complaint. Like, the only thing that I've been able to get through public records requests is the fact that a complaint was made. This is the nature of it in the sense of, dereliction of duty or discrimination and bias, right? There's no details that give us information about what actually happened, right? And then you see if it's sustained or if they've been exonerated. And if it's sustained, generally what I've been seeing, even in cases of egregious domestic violence, right? So a cop beat the crap out of his family and they filed a complaint with the department. Dude got 3 days suspension. Mm-hmm. Right. So the punishments for sustained complaints on, conduct with police often feel like a slap on the wrist, take a long weekend. You know what I mean? Very few times have I seen, the officer is asked to resign or he leaves the department anyways. Right. And again, you don't know the circumstances surrounding that. Right. And it's very difficult to be able to provide, abolitionists are trying to provide information to the city, to the public, that's going to help them understand what's going on within the police department and who the people are, right? And now we have it where police officers in the city during these actions, these protests, either remove their badges entirely or cover up their badge numbers. Mm. So we have no idea who we're dealing with, right? And, on the 25th of July, gang unit were there, SWAT were there, that were, you had plainclothes officers, you had officers in just tack vests and jeans who didn't have name badges, SWAT patches, or anything. And then you have uniformed officers looking absolutely bewildered. It was a complete mess. And we have no way of holding these officers to account when these types of things happen. And it's very clear that they are not servants of the public. They are their own dangerous gang that has the backing of the city, essentially.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and you're hearing Mel B on the continued protests against police killings in Omaha, Nebraska. Can you say, were there large demonstrations leading up to the 25th, like in response to the lack of charges being given to Gardner, or just around Scurlock's killing, or like what did the demonstrations look like, I guess?
Yeah, in the during the days of the week long curfew that we had and the first week of June, there were quite a few curfew defiance demonstrations that happened that I attended. A lot of them were downtown. They were, in the couple of days after James Scurlock was murdered, folks were understandably distraught. A couple of those demonstrations, they held vigil as close to the bar as they could because the police had completely shut down the block in front of the bar. No one could get near it. So they were holding vigil on the corner. James's family, his, the mother of his child, his sister were showing up, trying to understand what was going on and why the city didn't seem to care about it. The National Guard came in during that time, and folks were brutalized pretty significantly. So were journalists. I was maced in the face by a cop for not walking fast enough and, putting down the camera to help a 15-year-old or some young teenager who was screaming on the concrete because she had been maced in the eyes and she couldn't see, and in the weeks after that, there have been multiple demonstrations organized. There was some vigilante violence that happened where a black man was dragged by a truck in the parking lot of a McDonald's or something off of 72nd. So folks showed up that night to protest, the white supremacist response. There have been Back the Blue events, right? Mm-hmm. So counter protests that have been organized where folks have showed up to continue to keep the message on Black Lives Matter and racial injustice and James Scurlock's murder. And they've sort of happened with regularity over the last couple of months. I completely lost the month of June because I moved and I don't really know what happened in terms of like getting out there to report. But in July, there have been events protesting the use of tear gas against protesters because of the extremely up effects on reproductive health that people have been finding. I myself had that issue after coming back and being tear gassed in Minneapolis. There have been some other just various rallies outside of the courthouse. When the mayor presented its 2021 budget to city council, folks disrupted that. It was brilliant. They really flustered the mayor, but she ended up laughing in their faces essentially as they were escorted outside. All of these actions have been anywhere from 30 to 150 people, depending on which action it was and how fast people could mobilize. The next action that happened was July 25th. It was organized by a member of Pro-Black, and it was sort of this response to the Goon Squad of feds in Portland, a solidarity event, and also a protest that really focused on the messaging of James Scurlock. And it started off as a rally, and then they disrupted traffic and took a march downtown and back. And that's what kicked off this whole freaking national news scandal about how many protesters were arrested by the police. I went to that event. I was there the entire time up until the point where I was released from being detained by the police. Folks were extremely peaceful. They have a very clear set of demands that they have constantly put forward. They want to see a reduction in the police budget. They want to see the city to listen to folks who are talking about how the cops have 40% of the city budget, and they think that's absolutely ridiculous. They want people to take the James Scurlock case seriously and charge and convict Jacob Gardner for his murder. These are very clear demands that they have constantly been putting forth, right? And so this rally was this sort of extension of that. The cops arrested 120 people for a minor traffic violation that is generally a ticketable offense, and shoved them 50 people to a 14-person cell in a jail that has a COVID outbreak. From every point of that night where the cops were involved, just absolutely unconscionable behavior took place, right? You know, I witnessed some of my oldest friends being shot in the chest with pepper balls for the crime of standing in the middle of the street. They were shoved to the ground. They came up bleeding, you know. I myself was shoved by this cop twice, detained. They didn't believe that I had press credentials. They didn't believe that any of us had press credentials. They told us to our faces that they were fake and that we were going to go to jail, right? Clear violation of constitutional rights. These folks who were arrested were under the impression that they were going to get a ticket and be released, which is what has been pretty much the operating procedure of the Omaha police since the beginning of these protests, because these mass arrests overcrowd the jail. The jail is not equipped to process that many people at once. And so the jail had worked it out with the cops that if you have the ability to ticket them and send them on our way with a court summons, then they need to do it, because there's absolutely no way that they can get through these people and process them in any sort of efficient manner, even if the jail was completely empty, which it wasn't. That jail is just not equipped for that. It's not built that way. And they have been trying to keep it as, you know, empty as possible because there's a COVID outbreak. There are like 37 inmates who have COVID-19 and like 55 of the staff, right? Oh, you know, and this isn't, you know, these staff are trying to segregate themselves between, you know, just general holding and the long-term inmates at the top of the jail. But, you know, what I saw standing outside with jail support was just an absolute breakdown of the process. You know, folks told these absolute horror stories of what was going on inside. Just not good. Not good.
How many people did you say per cell?
45 to 50 was the count from people who came out and provided their own accounting of what happened. These cells are ICE holding cells. That literally says on the door, ICE holding cell occupancy, something around 16 people. But generally speaking, 14 to 18 people should be the absolute limit in these cells.
I can't imagine that they would have the facilities to just handle people's need to like clean up chemical agents that have been put on them, or give enough bathroom access to the people that are in those holding cells, let alone, like, again, as you said, there were already people in there, and this is during an outbreak of COVID. It's incredible.
Yeah, they said that in the women's cell, the toilet was not working. At one point, it backed up, and the drains were starting to expel dirty water while they were sitting in there. Multiple folks who had been sitting in the general holding area where there was airflow, you know, people had their masks on, were then shuffled into these cells at multiple points. Anytime they closed the door, it became too hot. There was no air circulation, and it would reactivate the capsaicin and the pepper balls. And the entire 50 people would start coughing because they had any way to clean themselves off. So many folks who had been pepperballed in the chest, who hadn't already, you know, gone to the hospital to get treated for trauma, essentially, and then sent back to the jail, they were burning for, 18 hours. And the processing took so long that they were holding people in the parking lot of the police headquarters up the street from the jail for hours. There's like photos of these protesters still in zip ties, trying to sleep on the ground. Multiple people passed out due to heat exhaustion and had to be taken to the hospital. Just absolutely unreal mistreatment by Omaha police, right? And both the county jail, which is its own department, and the Omaha Police Department are pointing fingers at each other. You know, it's their fault that this happened, and, they should have been prepared or whatever, right? And so there's really no one taking accountability for what was just horrible treatment of, all of these protesters. Some of them young, very young, 18, 19,
At least in California, like where I grew up, most of the instances where you would have the gang task force out would be multi-agency that would be coordinated either by like state or county police, and they would take the jurisdictional control of the circumstance. But in any case, that's like...
I mean, there was absolute confusion on the bridge, right? Because From where I was sitting, there was a member of SWAT, if I could remember his name, who seemed to be the one who had taken charge of the situation. Gang unit officers were also walking around instigating with, these various protesters. And you had uniformed officers who had detained folks for over 2 hours before they started taking information on the bridge, right? There was no conversation with any of the protesters who were like, what's next? We would like to know, we have a right to a reasonable amount of time between arrest and getting processed. Like, this is absolutely ridiculous. What is taking so long, and you have multiple officers who are just starting arguments with protesters, like clearly. And the ACLU, I imagine, is going to have a field day with this. But it felt like just total retaliation for the content of the speech that these folks were, the cops were just doing this to be bastards because they are,
Were legal observers also being treated similar to media? I mean, not that I think anyone should be like beaten up by police, but
the legal observer that has shown up and been there was arrested and charged, even though he had a legal observer vest and he's represented by multiple attorneys in the city. He was there in an official capacity. He mentioned that he was a legal observer. He was taking notes when he got thrown to the ground, continued taking notes until they arrested him. Yeah. The four of us who had press credentials were detained, released eventually after a completely different cop who came from police headquarters, this lieutenant. He took control of the situation, and within 20 minutes, everyone was off the bridge and the road had been cleared, and folks were sitting there for 2.5 hours. Right? So he released the credentialed members of the media, arrested a citizen journalist who did not have, he had the ability to prove that he was affiliated with the citizen, news network, which falls under the purview of the First Amendment, and didn't have a media badge. And so he was arrested and charged with the rest of them.
Can you talk about what the process of getting folks bailed out was like and what sort of infections have occurred since there was an outbreak in the jail at the time?
So it was very, very efficient. Folks who knew that the protest was going on were monitoring it almost immediately. So the first van of folks were the de facto leaders of the march, the people who were brutalized the most, and who were arrested first. They were bailed out within an hour and a half to 2 hours before the rest of the group showed up. From that point, what they did is obviously the bail number was ringing off the hook. So they started taking names. They started searching the databases. They were processing them to get names for folks. They were taking phone calls from family members, and they were just writing it down. So they were writing all the names that they could get, because it was really difficult to figure out exactly how many people were there, how many people were about to be booked. They really had to just start gathering information. And they sprung into action. There were members of the NLC and other jail support members who were outside of that jail from the moment people showed up to be processed until the last person was released 31 hours after that. They never left. Their process was to try and get the names, try and cross-reference it with the people who were being processed, and start removing bail money and just walking in one by one saying, hey, I know this person. This is my friend. I need you, I'm bailing this person out. And I don't know if they could do it multiple people at a time, but eventually it came down to a system of, 10 people at a time. They could get people to walk in to pay for the bail, and then they just had to wait. The jail had, quote, computer glitches, scheduled maintenance. I don't even know. They came out with 4 or 5 different stories that led to people who had posted bail still held in the jail over 20 hours later. Right. So, they had bailed people out systematically for the first 12 or 18 hours of these people's being in custody. And they finished the list. They got the final list. They double checked it. They posted bail for literally everyone and waited for an additional 12 hours for these people to be released. They were releasing them 2 at a time every hour or something, and that's 120 people. Right. Just absolutely total breakdown of the process, right?
I mean, it sounds like it was kind of consciously done.
There's a lot of conversation among the protesters about whether this was intentional, or they were intentionally making this a nightmare for people. I'm of the mind of, malevolent incompetence, that the jail really wasn't equipped, that a lot of people up in quick order, but they didn't necessarily give a about rectifying the situation on the back end, right? So it had the unintended consequences of, potentially trying to throw a wrench in the energy and momentum of the protesters, which I think they wanted to make an example of these protesters and just arrest them en masse. Like, that's what the cops wanted to do. During the next, 30 hours or so, I think they were just like, well, there's a problem. I'm just going to have to wait. You know what I mean? While anger in the city is just growing at a magnitude that the Omaha Police Department's PR machine just couldn't keep up with, A lot of people are pissed off. A lot of people are asking questions about why this broke down the way that it did. And the official statements had to be amended multiple times because protesters were speaking to national outlets and really getting ahead of them in terms of challenging their messaging in the most public of forums, both in the city and outside the city, as in Vice and BuzzFeed and these other publications, right? As far as folks coming down with COVID, I have not heard if anyone has gotten COVID. Thank God. My hope is that no one does. If someone contracts COVID, that is going to be a massive lawsuit for the city. Extremely massive, because they knowingly put these protesters in a COVID-infested jail. And if someone comes up positive, not good,
This is the Final Straw Radio, and you're hearing Mel B on the continued protests against police killings in Omaha, Nebraska. So you mentioned there being fallout because of the press fervor over what's happened and the national and international media coverage. How has it been felt in the city, besides the protesters and their immediate loved ones who are obviously quite upset about the way that this has been handled? Has there been a backlash against the either county commissioners or the city, the mayor, the police chief, any of that?
It's sort of split down the middle. I think a lot of longtime activists, both in North Omaha and in other places, sort of take umbrage with the tactics that pro-Black was using in blocking traffic. There's also a lot of folks who are like, it was a ticketable offense. It's a minor traffic violation. Why are we putting these kids in harm's way? So in the general public, the mood is sort of half and half, pissed at protesters for tactics that they believe are not furthering any sort of cogent anti-racist agenda, which is, your usual kind of conversation that comes out of something like this. And a lot of folks who are sort of have rallied to the cause of the protesters have started speaking up loudly about the city's handling of, increasing the police budget, of using CARES Act funding to buy a mobile command center for the sheriff's office. And also including, they just signed off on a $26,000 night vision goggle project for the Omaha police, right?
Oh, that sounds fun.
Yeah, it's great. It's awesome, right? The interesting thing about that specifically is that was the first vote that happened after folks were arrested on 7/25. And 3 city council members voted against that budget initiative, which was surprising to protesters because those 3 were, some of the most vocal supporters of the increased police budget. And the fact that they decided that wasn't, they dissented in that vote led some activists to think, okay, well, someone's listening, because that was surprising. They didn't expect it to happen. And it might be, the city is voting on its 2021 budget on August 11th, or I think their public comment section is on August 11th or something. There's a rally outside of City Hall that's supposed to happen. There have been multiple protests in solidarity rallies in West Omaha that saw some pretty good numbers. The ACLU is stepping in and is absolutely interested in filing lawsuits and other things on behalf of protesters to try and censure the cops because they're acting with impunity. And I think, the people that have the most power to potentially do something to sort of rein them in as these protests continue are certainly doing their best, I think, and are working overtime to stop this from fucking happening. And, you know, pro-Bloc has seen a surge in membership. I think their first meeting since the arrests happened, an extra 100 people showed up who wanted to join the group. So there's a lot going on, and it's all very interesting in terms of this reaction. I think the cops had the opposite effect that they wanted to have. They were trying to chill these protests. I mean, the biggest action that happened before 7/25 was the Bloody Sunday rally about tear gas and its effects on reproductive health. And these folks dumped a box of fake bloody tampons on the patio of Omaha Police Headquarters. You know, so it's been really interesting to watch. This sort of like rhetorical tit for tat. The Omaha Police Union is doing its best to make the leaders of this particular rally, the people who organized it, and someone who wasn't there, out to be vigilante villains. And it doesn't seem to be working super well. It's certainly emboldening the cops. One of those folks who was named in this Facebook post by the police union was unlawfully arrested the next day by cops, saying that she shoplifted a pair of sunglasses at a Walmart. And so, you know, it's ramping up. We're seeing some really interesting things happening, both in like a policy sort of level and, you know, in terms of the police and these protesters jockeying around each other. And I don't know, man, the riot line will be there forever until we really abolish the cops. So,
well, I mean, 40% of the city budget is that's a pretty hefty chunk of change. I'm sure that the cops and their union and their handlers do not want to let go of.
Yeah, they're pushing really hard. It's been really aggressive sort of PR campaigns about it. It's like 36.7% of the police budget, the city budget, is going to police. The police chief came out in an article saying, you know, if you cut the budget, then we're going to be cutting money to our social programs and crime prevention that we do, essentially threatening to not do their jobs if they don't keep their budget, right? And trying to extort the city to maintain. It's $162 million for a police force of 900 cops. Do you really need that much money? You know, like, what? Ridiculous.
It kind of sounds like after school programs or like midnight basketball or like community policing aspects. It might be what they're threatening to pull,
right.
Which is great because it's a terrible counterinsurgency project.
I mean, it's even with police involvement in some of these community programs that have come out of, you know, trying to build these spaces within the community that are sort of alternatives to folks falling into gangs or into otherwise preventable criminal activity, has some police oversight, but really they're just doing it on their own. Like the cops don't really do much except provide some public facing person to show up at these community meetings to discuss what they're going to do to keep these communities moving forward. It's all run by mostly Black women who are spending a lot of time trying to reach out and build these spaces within these communities to prevent crime, and they are having massive success, or were doing what they were doing. You know, I haven't checked in with it recently, but there's a lot of feathers and caps with that, and it's very clear that if the city, its communities, chooses to build community that doesn't need police, that it's a project that works and is worthwhile, right? And that often, just in the last week, cops have really stepped in it. You know, they held a Black man at gunpoint in the yard of his house in front of his entire family, and they had mistaken him for someone else who had run out of a car from a traffic stop. They held him at gunpoint for like 30 minutes. This poor dude is just terrified. His kids are crying, like... And thankfully, nothing major happened. But, you know, the same guy who they were looking for, they shot at him while he was running away because they said that he had unloaded his firearm on them. And ballistics reports come back that say that he had never even fired off a shot. and they grazed him in the ear. They almost killed him as he was running away.
That's so
because
lucky
he was afraid.
Lodge a bullet in someone who just happened to be a bystander.
Oh, dude, they were shooting their guns willy-nilly, and they injured people in their houses. Like, this is the cops.
Yeah.
What the are you doing? Just absolutely ridiculous. It's like, no, you don't need more money. You don't use it for anything useful. I mean, the legislature just passed some, mandatory diversity training, bias training, which on its face is extremely surprising that a red state has allowed that to happen, right? But eventually, is that really going to help?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. And abolitionists are working their asses off to keep, pushing this narrative forward, that there are ways to build community security that does not require agents of property and capital who have all the firing power. Because that's ultimately what it is. It's not about protecting life. It's about protecting property.
So you said August 11th is the public comments period in Omaha?
I believe so, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a rally planned for the 10th, I believe, outside of City Hall. The protesters are like, man, you need to drop all these charges. You need to rethink the budget. Jean Stothert, she's our mayor. We give you until the 10th to respond in kind, and if they don't get anything to the satisfaction of the protesters, they're going to hold a giant rally outside of City Hall to really show these folks that the community is no longer going to just sit by and let them move forward on these things without, community pushback, right? There are multiple state senators who also are, voicing their displeasure at how the police treated these protesters, and are working really hard within the state legislature to keep pushing these initiatives like citizen review boards and these various reforms that may provide a little bit of a stopgap to sort of rampant police violence that's happened across the state. Again, these initiatives never go far enough and will likely be gutted by opponents before they're voted on. But the fact that we are even having these conversations in our legislature is a far cry from 2015 when it wasn't even a blip on the radar. So it's pretty great. It's good to see that these conversations are happening. It means protesting works.
Blocking streets works, disrupting business as usual works.
Disruptions work.
Well, Mel, thanks so much for having this chat. Is there anything else about the situation in Omaha that you want listeners to keep on their radar coming up?
Really, what's going to be happening is Pro-Black is pretty determined as an organization, as are others, to really continue to do these sorts of unruly disruptions. Multiple times, organizers have said, we're not some docile public that is just going to take this anymore. A new generation of activists have really come up in the ranks of the various organizations and come out of spaces to really take charge of what is shaping up to be something that, I haven't seen before. In terms of tactics, in terms of organization and efficiency. I mean, it's really exciting. It's exciting to look for, to look at, and it makes me feel proud to be a part of this community in a way that I haven't felt in a while. And so really it's just going to be, if the ACLU continues to file lawsuits, those are going to become pretty high profile, I think. And just keep watching social media pages for what's coming next. So
cool.
Thanks for having me, though.
And I'll make sure to link up organizations like Pro-Black and the Nebraska Left Coalition and other ones that you've mentioned in the show notes.
Sure.
And what's your handle on Twitter so that folks can follow that live tweeting?
It's at Cold Brewed Tool. Pretty much all of my social media has that handle. You can find my Instagram, but all it has is really stupid selfies on it. But I have a reporting thread of the uprising this summer that I update continually. It's pinned to the top of my profile, so you don't have to, you can look through the reporting and see that there. Yeah, you can try and find me on Facebook, but I probably won't answer any friend requests. My Twitter DMs are open. So if any of your listeners are local, find me at a protest. My hair's blue. It's really not super hard to find me. Say hi. So thanks for having me. This has been great. Good conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.